When people imagine the fall of Rome, they often picture barbarians banging on the gates with all their might, legions collapsing, or emperors being poisoned in palaces. But empires don't fall solely because of external attacks. They rot from within, and one of the darkest forces driving that rot has always been money. Rome didn't fall just because of rebellions or corruption. It fell because of the collapse of its currency. And there are lessons to be learned from this collapse, lessons that apply to any modern economy that thinks it can play with money and escape the consequences. Let's set the stage. For centuries, Rome's economic backbone was the silver denarius. First minted around 211 BCE, this coin was nearly pure silver and was trusted throughout the empire and beyond. Roman soldiers were paid with it, merchants demanded it, and ordinary people stored their wealth in it. The denarius was more than money. It was a tangible expression of trust. The empire's power and the value of its currency were intertwined. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. But running an empire is expensive. Legions had to be paid, roads and aqueducts built, wars financed. By the 2nd century CE, Rome struggled to defend its borders against Germanic tribes, the Persians in the east, and internal unrest. Tax revenues couldn't keep up with military spending, so emperors turned to an old trick, debasing the currency. Instead of collecting more taxes, never a popular move, they reduced the silver content of the denarius. The numbers tell the story. Under Emperor Augustus, the denarius was roughly 95% silver. By the early 3rd century CE, under Caracalla, it dropped to 50%. By the mid-3rd century, during Gallienus's reign, the silver content of the denarius had fallen below 5%. A coin that was once nearly pure silver had become a bronze disc with a thin silver coating. People noticed and felt the difference. Inflation followed. When money no longer represented real value, prices rose. A measure of wheat that once cost a single denarius now required dozens. This wasn't an abstract theory. It destroyed lives. Soldiers demanded higher pay to keep up with rising costs. Merchants refused to accept devalued coins, preferring barter or gold. Local economies reverted to direct exchange because money was unreliable. And as trust eroded, emperors minted even cheaper coins to make up in volume what was lost in value. This created a vicious cycle of endless inflation. The crisis reached its peak during what is called the 3rd century crisis. Between 235 to 284 CE, Rome endured roughly 50 years of chaos, rebellions, plagues, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell at dizzying speed, sometimes dying after only a few months in power. Behind the political drama lay a broken financial system. Taxes were demanded in coins whose value declined daily. Farmers abandoned their land instead of paying taxes. Trade networks collapsed. And the Roman government took desperate measures like price controls and forced labor, none of which solved anything. One emperor, Diocletian, tried to stop the problem. In 301 CE, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, setting price ceilings for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to wages. Violators faced death. The edict was a disaster. Prices couldn't be controlled by law when money had no real value. Black markets flourished, and official trade nearly ground to a halt. The lesson became clear. The law cannot fix broken money. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius entirely. Constantine, around 312 CE, introduced the solidus, a gold coin with consistent purity. It brought some stability and was used for centuries in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. But by then, the Western Empire was already weakened. The devaluation of the denarius had drained Rome's economic core. Armies could no longer be sustained, trade networks were gone, and trust was shattered. Rome's collapse was not a single event. It was a long process, and the collapse of its currency was one of the most visible factors. What does this mean for us today? The destruction of money has always been a cause of empire collapses. Rome thought it could trick its people, issuing coins that looked real but had far less intrinsic value. Modern governments think they can do the same, printing paper money, manipulating interest rates, or erasing debt through inflation. But the outcome is always the same. People pay the price, wealth is destroyed, and trust collapses. Rome learned this lesson the hard way, and if we ignore it, our fate will be no different. History didn't stop at Rome. All major inflation crises since have followed the same pattern. Governments devaluing money to cover expenses, the wealthy protecting themselves with real assets, and ordinary people left impoverished. Rome's monetary crisis is merely the earliest comprehensive example, a blueprint for collapse. After World War I, Germany faced crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. The government thought it could cover debts by printing money, just as Rome once printed more coins. By 1923, hyperinflation had exploded. A loaf of bread that cost 1 pre-war mark now cost over 200 billion marks by autumn. People had to transport their wages in wheelbarrows. Retirees starved as their life savings vanished. And, as in Rome, those with debt were helped by inflation, while those with real assets, land, factories, foreign currency, prospered. Money became worthless, and economic misery paved the way for Hitler's rise. Zimbabwe in the early 2000s followed the same path, facing land seizures, declining production, and rising debt. The government turned to the printing press. By 2008, inflation reached an annual rate of 89.7 sextillion%. Prices doubled daily. Shops couldn't keep up with price tags. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency entirely, and citizens had to trade in US dollars or South African rand. Once again, a government thought it could fool reality. Once again, the people paid the price, but we don't need to look only at extreme examples. Even in modern developed economies, the Roman model persists. Take the United States. In 1971, President Richard Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard, severing its link to something tangible. From that moment on, the dollar became what economists call fiat money, backed only by trust in the government. And, as in Rome, the temptation to overspend became irresistible. Over the following decades, debt multiplied, the money supply expanded, and inflation became a constant. We didn't need wheelbarrows of cash, but purchasing power steadily eroded. $1 in 1971 is equivalent to more than $6 today. Money may look the same. The bills are the same. But the value has been quietly destroyed. The pattern is always the same. Governments disguise inflation as growth. Citizens are told that rising wages mean prosperity when costs are rising faster. Debt is sold as investment, but it finances consumption. The stock market rises even if most people don't own shares, and wealth is claimed to increase. Like Roman emperors, the basics are ignored, while every coin, bill, and paycheck quietly loses value. What makes this especially dangerous today is the global scale. Rome's collapse was an imperial crisis. Weimar's hyperinflation was a national crisis. Zimbabwe's crisis was local. But today, the entire world has enormous debt and central banks ready to print trillions at the first sign of trouble. This means the next collapse won't be limited to a single empire or country. It will ripple across the globe, and history shows that it will be the ordinary people, in their wages, pensions, and increasingly fragile currencies, who suffer, not the wealthy. So, what lessons can an individual take from Rome's monetary crisis? First, understand that inflation is deliberate. It is a policy that has been destroying empires for 2,000 years. Second, recognize that real wealth is not in paper or digital numbers, but in assets that retain value when money is devalued: land, resources, productive businesses, skills. Third, never assume stability is permanent. First-century Romans would have laughed if told their money would one day be worthless. Germans in 1913 couldn't imagine wheelbarrows full of cash. Zimbabweans in the 1980s assumed independence would bring prosperity, yet the same story repeated each time. Rome's collapse shows us that financial systems can fail slowly and then suddenly. When trust is lost, society collapses. Contracts break down, trade stops, armies disband, and governments lose legitimacy. Barbarians at the gate can finish the job, but the true killer has always been the treasury. And here's the point. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you in the same way. Rome's monetary crisis wasn't just about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about the fragility of money when abused by power, and that fragility has never disappeared. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History gives answers, and I'll show you where to look. See you in the next video, and I'm glad you're here.